film is about thalidomide. I expect it will surprise almost all of you, perhaps even shock you, that the thalidomide affair is not over. Last year, after 11 years of struggle, the children won their compensation. But there are still 98 children whose mothers believe they took thalidomide and who've got nothing. Thalidomide, the wonder drug, was introduced in 1958 by Distillers Company Biochemicals, part of the giant whiskey and gin firm of distillers. Its advertising said how safe it was. In its varied forms, it would take away your headache, put you to sleep and calm you. 2.5 years later, the drug was withdrawn after reports of deformities in newborn babies. In Britain, the parents of some of these babies began claims for damages against distillers. And because the matter was then sub judice, it rested for 10 years. In 1972, the silence was finally broken. The Sunday Times had begun its historic and untiring campaign to get compensation for children most of us had forgotten. As a direct result, public pressure built up, Parliament intervened, parents were called to many meetings, and eventually distillers settled.
We now have the 20 million protected against inflation. Now let's get the small print right.
But for some parents, the small print meant that the struggle was not yet over. Within the settlement, there are 2 lists of children, 342 on the X list who benefit, and 98 on the Y list who don't. To get compensation, a child must be moved from the Y to the X list. The X list were those mothers who could show proof that they had taken thalidomide in the first weeks of pregnancy, or they were children who were assessed as thalidomide damaged, mostly on the basis of examinations by just one child specialist. The Y-list parents are those who, when they came to look for proof, found their doctor had died or retired, or the medical records destroyed or missing. In some cases, the doctor denied giving the drug, although the mother remembers taking it, or the mother got the tablets from a friend or directly from a chemist. Anyway, like most of us, most of them didn't know what they were taking.
I asked him, did they put home visits down, you know, did they put everything down when they came to see you, if they gave you anything at home? And he said, well, they couldn't remember to put everything down. So, you know, could have just been missed off.
They were distressed because the thalidomide families had been awarded quite large sums of money, and yet they had what they regarded as thalidomide children who were receiving no money. They were bewildered because they didn't quite know what to do. They were an uncoordinated group of parents spread all over the country, and I felt they didn't quite know where to turn to.
Sandra Turtle was born without legs and with 2 crooked feet which have since been amputated. Her hips are deformed and her left hand has just 3 fingers. Her mother, Margaret, says that during her pregnancy, a doctor gave her 2 lots of tablets during 2 home visits, without prescription and in envelopes.
I've been having a lot of trouble sleeping and worrying, you know, so Stan sent for him, and he came and he gave me these tablets in an envelope. It had Distaval written on. Well, I'll always remember this because we had a little blue cupboard and I always kept these tablets up there. After I'd take them, I'd put them back. And, you know, I definitely remember that. And, well, my husband does too, because we kept saying we'd get rid of this little cupboard and it had a little ledge on. And we were going to take it down, but these tablets were on top. And I distinctly remember them, you know. I wouldn't forget them, actually.
Do you think the tablets that you took then were the same as those you took in the beginning, in the first weeks?
Well, I can't say they were because I can't remember.
Do you think you've been rather too trusting in all these years?
Well, I don't think we've pushed enough in anything, really, over the years, you know. With the legs and that, we don't push enough with them. I'm not a person that likes arguing and, you know, saying things to people. And I'm very timid, actually, of people. I don't, you know. When we go to see specialists and that, people have told me I'm too quiet and I don't say enough and ask enough, you know.
Keith Lewis is chairman of the Y Group Parents Committee, formed last year after it became apparent that those children left over would have to fight on. He is the father of 11-year-old Mark, who was born with arm and shoulder deformities. I asked Mr. Lewis why the wireless parents signed the settlement.
You must appreciate that this thing had gone on for ages. Everybody was basically happy with the amount of settlement. If all those children who were on the wire list held out, it would only slow down proceedings for the people who were on the X list who could receive compensation.
Alec Perkis, as an X-list parent, do you think the Y-list parents have been treated fairly?
No, I think their situation is most unsatisfactory. They've been in doubt for many, many months, many years in some cases, and still they have no idea whether their child will benefit or not. I wondered myself, why were their signatures necessary? But Distiller's offer was conditional on a majority, an unstated majority, of claimants accepting the offer. So another 90-odd acceptances helped Distillers to wrap it up.
You go to see a doctor and he tells you something, it gives you something, you trust in what he's giving you. I mean, same with solicitors, if you take your problems to him, he's trying to do it for you, just leave it with him in trust, don't you? I mean, you have to trust a person who's trying to do something for you.
Because Sandra's deformity does not follow a certain pattern, and because there is apparently no mention of thalidomide on her mother's medical record, she is on the Y list, and if she stays on it, she will receive nothing. The two lists were drawn up by the London legal firm Kimber Bull, acting for all the families. The effect was to weed out those children who didn't have proof or who weren't typically thalidomide deformed. But by signing the settlement, all the parents, X and Y, gave up all legal claims against Distillers. They agreed not to sue Distillers, but the Y list had to prove thalidomide damage to win the right to the X list. After the High Court approved the settlement, Kimber Bull advised the Y list to find new lawyers, as there was now a conflict of interest. For if a Y list family fought their way onto the X list, then those already there would get less money. Would they have signed if they'd known they'd had to find new lawyers?
I don't think people would have signed had they have known that the cut was going to be so quick, and had they have known that we were going to be left in a position of virtually no support.
She came in with a letter from the solicitors in London saying that they felt that at this stage she ought to be separately legally represented because her child had now been, or was, on the Y list, and that they were acting for the X list children.
David Brooks is a Lancashire solicitor acting for another Y list family. He is just one of those solicitors throughout the country who has had to pick up the endless legal strands of the thalidomide tragedy after Kimber Bull had stopped acting for the Y list children.
This child was born with his deformity, and she's been doing her utmost for the child ever since to establish that it was caused by this drug. She had had a lot of very detailed and complicated correspondence. I can't say whether she understood it or not. I imagine she found it very difficult to understand. It took me quite a long time to read it and understand it. She just came in with a plea to see what I could possibly do to help her.
Having caught the backwash of the thalidomide affair 12 years later, what is your view of two lists, X and Y?
I view it with suspicion. I think it's appalling, personally. From what I can gather, and I hasten to add it's only from my own information, there seems to be very little difference between the evidence which got some children onto the X list and some children onto the Y list. Perhaps I'm putting it a little highly, but it seems to me that somewhere along the line, possibly unknown to that person at the time, somebody has been asked to almost play God.
Very sparkling, natural, sparkling person.
Yeah, she's a great kid. She really is marvellous. Very bright, very alert.
Sonia West is 11. Her mother suffered from nerves during her pregnancy and took a great many pills. Mike, when do you think your wife took thalidomide?
It was back when she was pregnant with Margaret, and the illnesses she had between the pregnancies. She started getting in trouble with nerves. She was treated by the doctor at the time.
She doesn't remember what these were?
No, she wouldn't know.
Your wife takes a lot of pills.
She's had a history of nervous disorder when she was younger, just after we first got married, which happily is cleared up now.
I asked Mike West, when did he first suspect that Sonia was a thalidomide child?
Well, I think from the moment she was born, I assumed she was a thalidomide child. There'd been a lot of publicity with the drug being withdrawn a few months before she was born, or within a year anyway, and I just assumed she was. And everybody else seemed to assume she was as well.
In a campaign to uncover outdated medicines last October, 200 thalidomide tablets turned up in Worcestershire.
My GP, this was.
What did he say to you?
He said, he did mention thalidomide, you see, right? And I wasn't quite sure about this at the time. No, I wasn't sure about thalidomide anything. It's all new to me. And he said he wanted to know where I got the drug from, because he can't remember prescribing it.
Professor David Poswillow is a renowned specialist in birth deformities. For the past 5 years, he's devoted himself to finding out just how thalidomide works.
Pregnancy lasts 9 months, and people forget what happened in the first few weeks of development, and so it's extraordinarily difficult to get an accurate history. And you really cannot put a jigsaw puzzle together if many of the pieces are missing. So much depends on the clinical history. If one can establish that there has been thalidomide intake by the mother during the sensitive period, then I think it's impossible to decide whether a malformation was definitely caused by thalidomide or not. And in the presence of a powerful teratogen like that, I think the onus of proof is to prove that thalidomide didn't cause it.
We regarded ourselves as part of the group. It wasn't until the group split in two that we realized that we weren't actually part of the group. It meant that some children had been accepted and some hadn't. Not that they weren't going to be, but they just hadn't been accepted yet.
The one specialist whose medical opinion determined whether or not most of the children would join either the X list or the Y list was Professor Richard Smithles of Leeds University. The children were referred to him by the solicitors Kimber Bull.
Well, he talked to us of this. He talked to us of a list of thalidomide characteristics in a child, and that Sonia apparently didn't have enough of these for him to state that she was a thalidomide child. He couldn't actually say categorically that Sonia was thalidomide.
But he didn't say categorically that she was not thalidomide.
Oh, no, he didn't say that at all. If Sonia had been 3 or 4 months older, and she could have been conceived while the drug was actually on the market, officially on the market, he would have come down and put Sonia on the X list as a thalidomide child.
A number of children on the Y list were born after the drug was taken off the market. But just how quickly and how efficiently were doctors told about the drug? After reports of grotesque deformities from Australia and Germany, distillers wrote to doctors, drug suppliers and hospitals, and a withdrawal letter from distillers was published in both the British Medical Journal and the Lancet on December the 2nd, 1961. But it wasn't until 5 months later that the Ministry of Health wrote to doctors warning them of the dangers of Distaval, one of the brand names for the drug. But thalidomide was also contained in Asmaval, Valgrain, Valgis and Tensaval, and the ministry made no mention of these. Keith Yates was born at the height of the thalidomide births. He has spent most of his life in hospital and in pain. He has no ears, just holes in the side of his head.
During the 9 months of being pregnant, I was continuously being sick and migraine, and I was always going to the doctors every month for checkups, which is normal, but nothing seemed to help, and I was fed up of taking tablets, and by the time I got to 7 months, I kind of threw them all on fire.
How many tablets were you taking a day in those first weeks of pregnancy?
Oh, about 6 or 7. And when Keith was born, he was born at my parents' home. He was born with no ears, and nobody had ever told us anything, and we just kind of carried on and brought him up to the best abilities we could.
He was just being regarded as a deaf child.
That's right. He was. This is all what we was told, is he was deaf and was treated as a deaf child. Nothing else.
In spite of his deformities.
That's right. And that didn't seem to enter into it. everybody kind of was lenient.
He doesn't have, of course, he'd just had a hole on the side
That's
of his
right,
head.
and just a piece of skin up
Well, it
one
was
ear,
covered
and it's-
over. The ear
one
was
on the side
actually
was
covered
curved.
over, and one side was down here and the other side was up there.
Yes. So he was obviously deformed.
He was
yeah,
deformed.
He
Yeah.
was deformed, he had facial paralysis as well.
But despite this, 11 years passed before any member of the medical profession suggested to Mr. and Mrs. Yates that their son's deformities could have been caused by the drug.
I was talking about Keith, and this doctor just said to me, didn't I think Keith was a thalidomide child? And I said, I've never really gone into thinking about that. I was more interested in Keith's life. I said, we'd spend that much time going backwards and forth to hospital, we haven't really had time to think about it. He says, well, if I were you, I should do something about it, and fairly quick.
Did you ask your local doctor to look at his medical
Yes,
records?
and there's nothing on the records at all.
Inexplicably, Mrs. Yates' medical record begins in the 4th month of pregnancy, but it's in the first 3 months that thalidomide does its damage.
He says there's nothing on my medical records. He says, and have a look at prescriptions. Well, they only keep prescriptions for 5 years, so that was no use. By the time we got into asking about Keith.
He said he had nothing in
He
his
said
medical
that-
record about it.
He said he'd nothing in the medical record, but going back, he said that he had thalidomide tablets in his surgery, but he'd not given
He'd not
anyone.
prescribed them to anyone.
In fact, I understand that one of the doctors...
I asked Mr. Brooks about evidence in his family's case.
But I'm not satisfied with the evidence because no proper records were kept at the time. It's accepted that drugs were prescribed, but there's nothing on the record cards. Because I don't think doctors are bound legally to keep records. I think it's just that it's recommended that they should, for obvious reasons and for reasons such as this. But certainly in this particular case, it's made it very, very difficult. Clearly, if records had been kept and the drug had been prescribed, then one would have known one way or the other whether this drug was prescribed or not.
Is further medical evidence difficult to get?
It is, because it's difficult to get any medical person, specialist or otherwise, to commit themselves definitely on this point. I think it must be very difficult for them.
Why weren't they?
You tell me.
When you took Keith to see Professor Smithles, what did he tell you?
Well, he said that Keith was 50%, and he needed the other 50 from another doctor.
50% thalidomide?
Yeah, from another doctor, to make sure that he, we got the 100%.
So he was, in fact, saying that he was prepared to declare Keith a thalidomide damaged child if he had another doctor to agree with him?
Definitely.
That's right.
Yes.
So then also they had a medical record of Mr. Gill, which had done all the operations that we've been shown.
No, I went to see Mr. Gill, didn't I, over this?
You can tell.
And I was talking to him. I said, do you think that Keith is a thalidomide child? And he said that he did not think Keith was a thalidomide child because the simple reason he's had dealings with thalidomide children. And a thalidomide child usually has deformities of arms and legs, where Keith is not, it's his ears.
He didn't conform to the type?
No.
What one can say, I think, is that thalidomide generally produces anomalies which are fairly typical and fairly characteristic. But for all sorts of reasons which we don't understand and which may be related to the genetic background of the individual concerned, the response may be atypical. And when the response is atypical, then the malformation could be atypical.
In what percentage of the cases that you tested did you find deformities in ears and arms?
When thalidomide is given between the 20th and the 25th day of development in the primate, we know that the ear and limb is affected. Very frequently asymmetrically affected. One side may be worse than the other, but by and large we get most of them affected if we give the drug at the appropriate period.
So the majority of ears would have been affected?
The large majority, yes.
So imagine trying to get a child to get a job, where in fact a doctor wants him to go twice a week for a dressing. Who's going to employ him? Give him a job as an apprentice? And this is what he wants as a child, to have an apprentice so that he's got a full job when he turns 21. The way things are, there's no future.
Do you, looking back now, think you've been rather too trusting?
I think so.
Probably.
Yeah. You see, we was both 17. I don't think we'd enough experience with being a family life. We never, don't think, really understood of having a child which was deformed. All we was interested was the child himself. We was really happy with him. we kind of thought, well, just live a normal life. That's all we ever asked for, was to live a normal life, but our normal life never seemed to exist. It still doesn't seem to come that way now, because he's still waiting to go in hospital again. Yeah.
Tell me about that painting of the little boy up there.
Oh, I couldn't just resist buying that. It just reminded me of Keith when I used to see him in hospital. I just loved it.
We had a settlement which came from an offer based on moral responsibility. Distillers accepted their moral responsibility, not legal liability.
It wasn't until the autumn of last year when I realised what a serious problem the wire list was becoming, because not a single family from the wire list had been transferred to the X list. And of course, unless they're transferred, they get no money at all.
Seems to me that the simple answer for the Y list tragedy dilemma is for that very medical panel set up by Dr. Vaughan to assess the extent of the injuries of the X-list children, for them to examine each Y-list child and give their opinion on whether the child is thalidomide damaged. That panel has the widest experience and competence, having already examined over 300 X-list children.
Where do the Y group go from here?
The only way they can go is to try and convince distillers' solicitors that they are not Y group and in fact should be on the X group list. That in fact the deformity affecting the child or the child of the family was caused by their drug, or it is more than likely was caused by their drug.
I think people should appreciate that these parents are not asking for something that they're not entitled to, but what they are asking for is that there should be no reasonable doubt, one way or the other, as to whether these children are thalidomide deformed or not. It just isn't good enough when we're talking about a child that's got no arms, no legs, is not going to be able to live a normal life, is going to require a lot of finance in order to live. You know, is it right that on such woolly information his whole future should be decided?
What can a Y-list family do if they fail to get on the X list?
They can, within the terms of the agreement, as I understand it so far, apply to the High Court, to the judge, for an opinion, a final decision. When one has evidence to support it, or further evidence, or the best possible evidence one can accumulate, and go before the judge and say, look, this is what we have, this is what we say, these are all the facts as far as we're concerned and concerning our case. We want you to say whether you consider this child is an X-list or a Y-list child.
Well, it's not our life I'm thinking about, it's Sandra's later. I mean, it's Sandra, you've got to think about how she's going to manage when she gets older, and, you know, if she had a bit of something behind her, you wouldn't worry about when she got old. I mean, now our worry is what how she's going to manage and what she's going to do when she gets older. I mean, that's really what you're fighting for, isn't it? Because sometime or other she's going to have to look after herself.
We're more concerned in Keith's life and we're thinking more of his future. Yeah, this is what we're fighting for, you know.
We just got to think about Keith when he leaves school and gets into a man.
But we're never going to have any money whatever happens. We're never going to have money.
Why do you say that?
Well, because we aren't. Money's going to Sonia, given to Sonia.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
We won't have money.
But I meant you, I meant Sonia.
We won't have any control over the money. We don't want any control of the money. We just want it there for Sonia's security when she's older.
See, we don't.
Money couldn't help a great deal now. Not now. Couldn't really help us. Couldn't really help Sonia now. Make life a little bit easier, perhaps. Perhaps take a little bit of worry off our shoulders, but not really help her. It's when she's older. It's when she's really going to need some help. And that's what the money's for. When she's older.
When she's a teenager.
Well, when she's older than that. When she's older than that. When she's middle-aged. When we're not around to look after her. She's going to need money then. This settlement, this lump settlement, is supposed to provide an income for these children until the last one of them dies. Now that is the exact words. Until the last one of them dies. When the last one of these thalidomide children die, that fund should be empty.